First, before I start explaining how this all happened to me, there is one thing that must be said. Cryptids are real. Most of those folk tales passed down from generation to generation are anything but. So to anyone thinking they can run into the woods and taunt forces they can't begin to understand, heed my advice. If you value your life, don't mess with things you shouldn't be messing with. Trust me when I say you won't live to regret your mistake. Now I can begin. My name is Joseph, and yes, I am a skinwalker. I'm not the type usually mentioned in these types of stories, however, although I do know some that are mentioned in these stories. Anyway, I'll get to the point of this. When there comes a time for a child to be born, there are several children that are sensitives, and those that are sensitive get chosen. We who are sensitive to evil or good can see what normal people can't. ESP, as many scientists believe to be paranormal or supernatural, but you have to see it in the eyes of us who have been taught that everything is possible and it is all limitless. So basically, we see things and we let our elders know. Now when children cry, it's either because something is bothering them or they sense something bad. When a child is laughing or is smiling while no one is in the room, it could be a good spirit playing with them, or it could be a bad spirit playing with them. It's hard to tell because there is nothing evil in the beginning. It's all trickery to us because they can't harm the innocent. I was one of these children who was a sensitive, and I was given the name #Deeswood, which translate to one who walks around with warriors, or one who is always honest with those he encounters. Now with me, my grandmother raised me to be a good kid, never into the going out at night or opening a window at night or whistling at night. No, that's what caused the bad spirits over to you. So I did nothing but listen to her stories of all these things. My father came into the picture when I was like 5 or 6, and he just visited from time to time. Now when I turned 8, I was allowed to go with him to his place. He then started my training, as I call it. I was hunting and gathering things with him. I thought it was fun because I was hanging out with my father. Now when I turned 9, it began. I was the youngest of the group of kids chosen by his elders to partake in this event. I was a sensitive, and still am, so they performed a 3-day ceremony in which they had a huge bonfire going and they were dancing around it. They had their skins and animal skins. When I say skins, I mean human skins as well. There were people getting butchered and mutilated in these camps in the caves on top of the mountains near my hometown. I vividly remember watching a man get slaughtered, and I can remember his screams of agony. This is what haunts me to this day. I tell people all the time, dude, you have no idea what it's like to go through hell or have to hear screams from it or even watch it. We, the children, have to sit in front of a mirror. This mirror is like a portal to another deep dark dimension, and it remains dark until the ceremony is almost complete. It reflects our image, but in a ghastly way. Now the chants and songs are being made while people around are getting slaughtered, and we have to fast without food or water for the whole 3 days while in front of these huge bonfires while watching our own image in a dark mirror. Keep in mind that they choose up to 15 kids and only 3 of us make it out alive. I'm the youngest of all of them. Now the 4th day, we have to go around talking to animals in their language, and we have to understand them. We have to play with some and then challenge some, all while being observed by skinwalkers that are already initiated. If we pass with their approval, we get to do one more thing, eat. But in order to do so, we have to kill either an animal or a human. Then we eat whichever we kill. I killed a prairie dog because I couldn't even stand the thought of eating a person. That's what sets the skinwalkers apart, whether you eat an animal or a human. Eating an animal will most likely result in us being able to obtain white or clear eyes unless you eat snakes or coyotes. Eating a human will always result in obtaining the famous and infamous red or yellow eyes. Once the sacrifice is made and you survive through it all, you obtain the right to be called a skinwalker. Now keep in mind that even skinwalkers play by the natural law. They come together in this time, be it bad or good skinwalker, to raise more skinwalkers. But this only happens on very rare occasions in which there are changes that are being made by the planet due to climate or interplanetary change. We are more in tune with nature than most. We understand the crystal and how it communicates to us. This is why most scientists believe that logic does not mix with reality. Logic is their way of trying to explain something that they don't understand and are afraid of. We, on the other hand, know enough that there are always going to be things we can't explain, but we will describe them. We won't be afraid of it because if it's in our world, then it must be in others as well. Meaning it was always there to begin with, so it's nothing new to the universe, but it is to us, therefore it is not supernatural or paranormal. The same goes for spirits, aliens, UFOs, they're just crossing over, no big deal. Now Mother Earth provides us chosen with massive amounts of energy, which we can keep forever. We have the power to manipulate and control certain things. I for one can control the weather with my emotions, and I can befriend any wild animal, and I can also manipulate people's thought processes. I was chosen with clear eyes, and I was given a bald eagle feather. See, most don't know this, but you don't need the full skin to transform. You just need a piece of a part of the animal. When I transformed for the first time, it took me 12 hours to master the art. I had to let go of all the limits I was taught. See, I was taught that I could only go so far before there would be no limits like they teach nowadays, but you have to let it all go in order to realize the beauty of shifting. Once shifted, you can fly as high as you see fit. Some time passed and it was great, now being 15 and flying over shiprock at high speeds. Having pure sight of everything was the best. Then I did something stupid. I transformed back while I was trying to land. I landed on my face. Hard. I stumbled a bit and I couldn't remember anything for a while, but then I caught my thoughts and I knew what I had done. I was proud of myself. I was greeted back at the caves with joy and food and water. I enjoyed every meal afterward because I was hungry. The other kids had turned too. One transformed into a snake and the other was a cougar. We were happy until it came time to face the mirrors. I got in front of my mirror, stared into my own eyes, and saw great glory. Clear eyes. The mirror then finally became wavy as if it was part of the water and something had hit it to make it start to wave. In the mirror was a mountain of flames, and towering over the flames was a dark winged creature that had a long jaw and what looked like ram horns. It stared at me and it called me its son, but it said my purpose was to help those in need and to fight for the better good. Therefore, it rejected me and said that I was no longer its son and it was going to protect me from harm, but it would still have nothing to do with me. The mirror cracked and the pieces fell. The other kids didn't have the same experience. Their mirrors were returned to normal, so I guess I was the one that the mirror decided to show me this image. Years passed by quickly after that whole experience, and I decided to traverse the world myself to see what other mysteries were ahead of me. Since then, I have been able to transform into various other animals, and during certain times, had to fight not only hunters for the safety of innocent animals, but various other cryptids in order to keep myself and sometimes campers to stay alive. I have many stories about my encounters and scuffles with these other cryptids, even some being famous in folklore around the world. Wendigos, for one, have always been a pain in my side to deal with, and at times I had to deal with my own Skinwalker brethren. On occasion, I'll clear the clouds, and during the day, I make sure no animals harm people and no people harm animals, while at night, I'll always be on guard so no cryptids cause trouble. After all, like I said before, lots of people love to wander around in places they're not supposed to, and in territory that should never be trespassed by people. As long as I still can, I will try and protect innocent people and animals from other cryptids that go bump in the night. I have to go now. Those hunters always seem to find where I am. I think it's about time for me to move around again. Can't be too careful after all, especially since the government likes to cover up things like us from the public eye. I'll check in again and write about some more of my experiences and anything new once I know that I'm in a secure location. Until then, I hope you all enjoy your lives. Just remember, you never know when someone or something could come along and take it from you. This all happened about 5 years ago. One night, a few of my friends decided after a night of hanging out that we'd go on an adventure at about 3 a.m. We took a ride about 50 miles to this old Spanish room in New Mexico. I can't for the life of me remember what that place is called. So we jumped the front gate to the place and started exploring. One of my friends brought a flute with him and I started playing it. Something started screaming really loud on the tops of the long destroyed walls of the place. It was going from wall to wall really quickly, screaming the most blood-curdling scream you've ever imagined. We got out of there quick, fast, and in a hurry. One of my friends actually pissed his pants and drove for a few hours to National Monument, where we planned to camp out for the rest of the weekend. We got there at probably 6 or 7 a.m. and set up our camp. After a few hours of just talking about what happened at the ruins, I went to take a piss about 300 feet away from the camp. This is where everything starts getting a little fuzzy. I remember seeing 2 dust devils coming our way, and when I turned around again, 2 of my friends were there and they were motioning me to follow them. I couldn't help but follow them like I was being pulled behind them in shackles. I followed them for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, and then I snapped out of it. These were not my friends. They had bright red hair with my friends' faces and cat eyes. Both of these friends were brunettes. I stopped walking and it looked at me with the most terrifying gaze I had ever seen. Monsters in movies are nothing compared to this. I turned around and ran as fast as I could the way that I came. After about 5 minutes of a full sprint, I got back to the rock that I had pissed at and found our camp. Everyone was there, still sitting around talking, and didn't even notice that I was gone. I told them what happened with the look-alike skinwalkers. We packed up everything and left, probably within 10 minutes. This took place in the 1950s when my mother was small, maybe about 6 or so. She said she used to play with her little cousin who was 5 on the road. Well, her mother had an argument with her brother, and her father left on the wagon to get water a few miles down. Her cousin's mother lived near her family, so they had company for the most part. Neighbors lived about 3 miles west and 4 miles south. It was dirt roads. The rural area that they lived in was covered in forest, so there were a lot of tall pines, cider, and oak trees everywhere. It was a great place in Arizona, not too far from the New Mexico border and not too far from Window Rock. They were playing by the abandoned dirt road, just the 2 of them. It was far, far away from the house and the main dirt road past a large number of trees. They were having the best time, just by themselves, playing with their dolls. Suddenly, my mother smelled something. It was like rotting meat, and she heard a crunch of sticks and leaves behind her. She looked back towards the large pine tree that leaned. Under it sat a woman with waist-long, dark peppered hair. She was just watching them as they played. She was wearing a lot of sterling silver and turquoise jewelry. She had body paint that stunk and wore a coyote pelt to cover herself. My mother said that she couldn't move and just stared at it just as it stared back at her. And by no means was this woman pretty in the least. The woman had a demonic look with what could be described as bloodlust as her eyes trailed back and forth between my mom and her little cousin. Her little cousin wasn't even aware of it yet because she was always up playing in the mound of sand. Heart pumping, ears ringing, my mom said she was so scared. Her breath felt stolen, and the smell was so bad that she was getting dizzy, yet she couldn't move. Finally, she started muttering to her cousin, "Vivian, Vivian, there's something under the tree. Vivian, there's something under the tree. Run, Vivian." Vivian looked up and saw the lady. Screaming in terror, Vivian burst into tears as the lady watched them, smiling. The woman raised her finger and beckoned them to come over. When my mom grabbed Vivian and ran down towards the main road just in time for my grandpa, he was coming back from getting water with the horse-drawn wagon. "Dad," she said, "there's something sitting under the tree over there." Her father got very angry and started yelling at them. "Why are you playing way back out there? Get in! It's probably just your imagination anyway." He looked over there, and then he saw it. He saw the old lady, and she had gotten closer to them. "That's a skinwalker," he said. "Come on!" And then they ran back towards the house. He went back with her older brothers, but they never found it again. There was only one person with her that long, and that was his cousin, who had no kids and lived 7 miles west of them. My mom said that she couldn't ever forget seeing that. It was a tragic experience just knowing what could have happened to them if it had gotten to them first. This didn't happen to me, but to a very close friend of mine. I've heard a lot about coyotes and skinwalkers and had a weird experience or 2 with coyotes. The creepiest thing is waking up to my sleeping bag being surrounded by paw prints without even hearing them during the night, but never anything paranormal, so to speak. Patrick's story, however, it kept me from going back to my favorite backcountry secret stash. He was leaving my area one morning. He'd been camping there a couple of days, and so there was a coyote that always seemed to be close by. like in his peripheral vision, but never clearly. He loaded up his truck and started to drive down the road. At the end of the road, he could hear the coyote following him. When he pulled onto the road, he was running next to him. Now he was freaking out, so we sped up. He said he was going 35 miles per hour or so, and it was running along beside him. Definitely not possible. When he looked back, the coyote was running on 2 legs and was wearing what Patrick said looked like buckskin pants. An instant later, it was a person wearing coyote fur, keeping pace with his truck. He looked again. It was gone. We never went back to the grove after that. The hunting cabin was just as I remembered it. It was tiny, hardly bigger than a tool shed, and after a year of neglect, dust now coated every surface. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years, not since the last time I went hunting with my grandfather, Sebastian. I had been so terrified by the creature we saw in the woods that I hadn't wanted to return, and my parents just assumed I was too bored to want to spend 2 weeks with the boring old man. Gramps still came to visit us, but thankfully we never went there. When Gramps passed away a year ago, he left the cabin and the 30 acres surrounding it to his only remaining grandchild. At 20 years old, I had never expected to set foot on the rural mountainside again, much less inherit it, but a bad breakup had left me the decision of moving into the cabin or into my parents' basement. The choice had almost been hard to make. The local newspaper, the Village Times, had claimed that Gramps died of a bear attack while out chopping firewood behind his cabin. I didn't buy that story though, and even as I pulled my beat-up old Ford into the unpaved driveway, I had my hand on my gun. The old Remington might not do much to the creature roaming in those woods, but it still made me feel better. I hadn't seen the thing in a decade, but if it was still around, then I would be prepared this time. Several hours later, I unpacked, and the cabin was decently clean. All of the utilities were hooked up, and the refrigerator was stocked. I had taken the week off of work so that I could adjust to my new lifestyle, and I was planning on just relaxing for the next few days. My first night and day passed uneventfully, but by the second night, things were getting a little weird. I had spent enough time in the country as a child to be familiar with creatures like raccoons, skunks, bears, and other mammals, but the freshly made claw marks on the side of the cabin weren't anything I recognized. I woke up on my third morning to the googes, and I was pretty unnerved. They were too large to belong to any small critters, too high up to be from coyotes, and too wide to be from a mountain lion or bear. In this neck of the woods, that ruled out everything logical. As I studied the claw marks, I wonder how I could have slept through them being made. They definitely hadn't been there when I first arrived, and the fresh marks stood out in a bright contrast to the weathered wood of the cabin walls. I suppose a human could have made them with a knife, but I didn't have neighbors for miles. Who would be skulking around out there just to prank me? It didn't make any sense. It crossed my mind that my ex might have done it just to freak me out, but Sandra lived about 50 miles away and didn't have the address for the cabin in the first place. I don't use social media enough to bother listing my new address, and we didn't have friends in common or anything anyway. I eventually shrugged to myself, deciding just to let it go. I knew that worrying about it wouldn't help, but that afternoon I found myself driving the 10 miles into town and buying some motion-activated floodlights and also a motion-sensing camera. 2 more nights passed, and each morning I woke up to the claw marks getting closer and closer to the cabin door. As much as I wanted to believe that it was a stupid prank, I had to admit to myself that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that idea. The floodlights would turn on and the camera would snap, but all I ever saw in the photos was an empty yard. I had even tried to set up a video on my phone, but all it managed to capture was a vague blur of movement at the edge of the screen. I had had enough. On the 5th night, I went outside, gun in hand, and settled comfortably on the porch steps. There was no noise, no sound to indicate that the usual nocturnal critters were up and about. I shut all the lights off and waited for the creature that I knew would come. Hours passed, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, I snapped myself out of a doze. I could hear something moving quietly out by the edge of the woods where a figure was skulking around, its features hidden in shadows. As the creature drew closer, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. It was Sebastian, my supposedly dead grandpa. The unclothed figure paused in mid-step, its head slowly turning to face me after hearing me gasp in shock. Gramps looked sickly, with skin pale and visible ribs. He was bald now, his once Santa-like beard and hair gone. "Gramps?" I could hear the quiver in my voice, and my hands were shaking from terror. The gun had fallen to my lap, nearly forgotten in the intensity of seeing my presumably dead grandfather. I had been so convinced that the antlered creature I saw years ago had killed Sebastian that I had never once considered that my grandfather might still be alive. "Gramps, what are you doing? Come home!" Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I didn't care what my grandfather had been doing or why he was out there. All I cared about was that he was alive. I just wanted to hug him again. "Run, stupid boy! It's coming!" Sebastian's voice barely sounded human. His warning came out as an almost reptilian hiss, and before I could respond, Gramps was bouncing into the woods on all fours. He was gone in the blink of an eye, the bushes hardly swaying where he had passed through. The woods remained as eerily silent as they had been, even though my grandfather's retreat should have made a large amount of noise. Not a second later, a low growl came from behind me, the sound reverberating off the cabin walls. A massive creature, the one from my memory, approached from around the side of the cabin. Within seconds, it became clear to me that it wasn't a human or an animal, unless someone was wearing an amazing costume. The creature was every bit as surreal as I remembered it. Long, pale limbs sprouted from an emaciated torso, and the ivory deer skull shined in what little moonlight managed to bleed out through the clouds. It was wearing ragged old buckskin leggings and had beads around its neck. I couldn't see any eyes, but I knew without a doubt that it was staring directly at me. I think it was a Wendigo or Skinwalker, though the difference between the two types of monsters was always a bit beyond me. Before I could take in any more detail, the thing began to laugh, a gutturally sound that echoed in my head hauntingly. It was laughing so hard that it nearly doubled over, and I realized that its limbs were able to wrap around its body twice. I raised the gun and fired several shots at it point blank, the bullets lodging firmly into the creature's neck and torso. The being looked down at its new piercings, and it began to dig out the bullets at an unhurried pace. It dropped them onto the ground like a child plucking flower petals, and it seemed to sigh in irritation as it dug out the last one. Why must humans always do this? It spoke in such perfect English that I was dumbfounded. What was going on? What did the creature want? Had Gramps known about this horrendous-looking thing? My head began to ache with the strain of trying to figure it out, so I turned my attention back to the monster. The bullets clearly hadn't done more than annoy it, and I have expected it to lunge at me. No forthcoming apology. It was still staring at me, its foot tapping impatiently as it waited. It shouldn't sound so human. I tried to say something, but my voice came out as more of a strangled squeak than my usual baritone. "Well, I suppose that shall do. Now get along inside before that evil little denizen comes loping back." I just stood there. I tried to will my feet to move, but I was so scared that I felt my bladder give out instead. Warm pee ran down the side of my leg, and for just a second, my mortification overruled my terror. "Oh, really now? Urination? Truly? Have you not conquered your base instincts beyond this primitive farce?" The creature cut me off. "It is not all about you, you know. Sebastian was a dear friend of mine, and one would think you would offer condolences instead of shooting me like a barbarian. But you're a monster." Of course. Your simple little mind should be able to comprehend this more familiar and a bit better." Suddenly, the horrifying creature was gone, and in its place stood Sebastian's best friend, Rufus. Rufus had been around as long as I could remember and had always been a kind old man. He supposedly lived on the other side of the mountain, even though I had never actually seen any houses over there when Gramps and I would hunt. Rufus just always sort of appeared out of nowhere, usually startling us so badly that we had almost shot him a few times. "There, boy, this better for you?" I merely nodded, still not trusting my voice. This was just a nightmare. I fruitlessly tried to convince myself that I must have dozed off on the porch and that I could probably wake myself up if I tried hard enough. I began pinching my exposed skin mercilessly, a bruise forming after a few rough grabs. Rufus was watching me, his head cocked to the side questioningly. "What in tarnation are you doing, whippersnapper?" I've got to wake myself up." "Sorry to break it to you, kid, but this ain't no dream here. Now get your hide on inside, for that thing that looks like your grandpappy comes back and gets you." I was shaking so hard from fear that I could barely move my limbs, but I managed to navigate the steps. I'm not entirely sure why I obeyed the creature, but seeing it morph into a familiar face was easier to deal with than the knowledge that it was probably about to eviscerate me with every step. I needed some semblance of normalcy, so I went about my usual pre-bed routine. I mindlessly made sure all the doors and windows were locked. Then I took a hot shower to help relax and clean myself up. I crawled into bed after, my adrenaline finally calming down. Now I was just in pure shock, and I noticed that I was repeatedly reassuring myself that I would wake up and everything would be normal. Too bad even getting this written down hasn't managed to convince me that things are okay. I was spending a month with my cousins at my grandma's house. It was August. My cousins' ages ranged from 10 to 15. I was the oldest, being 15. I was staying with a 10, 13, and 14-year-old. We stayed up telling scary stories often, but one night, a few weeks later, we decided to make a campfire out back. My grandma's house is in a rural suburb. The neighbors aren't too far when you're driving down the road to her house. Within the backyard, it's thick forest with man-made paths. Each house is on a hill, so only part of the basement was actually underground. That isn't important until later though. So we're towards the east of her yard in a smallish patch of open land. You couldn't see the neighboring yards from there, and there was probably 3/4 of a mile to each side of us that belonged to my grandma. It was maybe 11 at night, and we were playing truth or dare after telling scary stories. My 14-year-old cousin dared me and the 13-year-old to go walk through the paths for 10 minutes or so. I said yes right away, as I wasn't easily scared and rather level-headed, but my younger cousin was a bit more hesitant. We didn't bring a flashlight because it wasn't really that dark yet, and we could see enough to not die. We were walking through the paths for about 5 minutes and could barely see the fire through the trees. When we decided to turn, in the middle of the path was a large dog-like creature hunched over with its front hands an inch from the ground. What I remember most was how its eyes were so freaking bright white. It was a humanoid dog-shaped with a human-like head but a dog-like body but human hands as feet. It looks right at us, and I know I was paralyzed with fear as it dashed away the opposite way from us towards a creek that ran through the yard. Eventually, my cousin and I screamed bloody murder. I don't remember much here because I was really disoriented and I couldn't think properly, but I did wake up in bed, so I assumed that I was brought up to the house. All the kids slept in the basement in a big room with sliding glass doors, so the outside of the room was on the side that was underground. My bed was pressed against a big glass window, and I could see my cousins playing outside down below the houses in Michigan. So it gets slightly chilly, even at the end of August. There was a slight breeze, so I put on a jacket and ran to join them outside skipping breakfast, not wanting to miss out on anything fun. When I got down there, I could tell that they weren't playing, but rather running to get my grandma. Her dogs, both of them, were dead. They were ripped open. That night, we went to bed early. I woke up at maybe 2 in the morning because I felt something in my head. My cousins were all sitting on the double bed opposite to me on the other side of the room. There was one bunk bed and 2 double beds. The double beds were for me and my 14-year-old cousin. They were being quiet and stared at me. The 13-year-old nodded his head towards the window. I froze. They all looked afraid. I turned my head slightly to the side and I saw a really messed up looking face pressed up against the window with gaping eyes looking down at me. I screamed so loud and bolted out of there. My grandma called the police after I told her what happened, and they found nothing. I went home after that, and I have never been there during the night again. I've never seen anything myself, which I'm grateful for, but boy, have I heard a lot of stories growing up in the reservation. I have benefited from being around the people who have. There is a different kind of evil that exists in the quiet high deserts and deep sandstone canyons of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, even Colorado. I can only describe it as an ancient evil. Now there are some helpful ceremonies, rituals, and traditions that are still practiced to this day. I mean, even the local hospital has an on-duty medicine man, but it seems to be a double-edged sword. What I mean is there's also black magic, which most deny and will not even acknowledge or speak of. We are very superstitious and are happy with taboos. You will find this with most First Nation people. From Alaska to Argentina, it's just something you don't do in fear that it will get the attention of unwanted spirits or harmful beings. Skinwalkers are just a few stories that keep me up at night with the covers over my head. Here's a quick one for you. A Navajo travel police officer was driving west on what used to be officially named Highway 666. It was lately snowing, and he sees an old woman walking on the side of the road. How she got there, or where she was going, was not apparent because she was so far out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't see her right away, but as he passes, he noticed that she's dressed in traditional clothing, a shawl, dress, and her hair is in the traditional bun. This isn't too odd because many elders still choose to dress traditionally. But why was she out in such cold weather this late at night? Hitchhiking? Maybe. He passed her too quickly and now has to turn around. And as he makes a U-turn, he noticed that she's nowhere to be seen. This is fairly flat terrain, and he has for sure seen an old woman walking. He pulls a squad car over and steps out with his flashlight. Confused, he manages to find the woman's footprints in the shallow snow. He follows the footprints until they suddenly turn into what looked like dog footprints leading away from the road in a hurry. He immediately jumps back into the squad car and meets up with another officer near his patrol. He's a little shaken up, but asks the other officer if he's ever seen anything like that. The officer tells him that he has. He also explains that sometimes it's an old woman, sometimes a very beautiful young girl, but always on that road and always in the snow, waiting for the right good Samaritan to let her into their car. I still get nervous driving those wide open spaces at night. I keep my eyes strictly on the road and turn my music up high. I rarely pick up hitchhikers, but I never pick them up at night. Every summer, my family and I go camping up in Ellsworth, Maine. It's about a 3-hour drive from my house. The camp itself is about an hour from the nearest town. I've been going to this camp my entire life as my family owns it, and we've never had an incident like this happen before. I was watching TV in the middle of the night. Both of my brothers and my parents had gone to bed. I heard a noise coming from the kitchen and realized that the dogs needed to go outside to do their business. So I took my brother's 2 pit bulls and my dog outside after turning on the porch light. I walked around to the front yard and let the dogs off the leash. It's so incredibly dark in the woods in Maine, but the porch light really only illuminated the porch and nothing else, so I tried to keep an eye on them. I was momentarily distracted when I saw a loon, a wild bird, on the lake. When I looked back, I saw that the pit bulls were both looking at something in the woods. I couldn't see what it was, but I assumed that they'd seen a squirrel or a raccoon. I soon realized that I didn't see Alfie anymore. She's an awfully small dog, and she's also completely black. I called for her a few times and heard some soft whimpering right where the dogs had been looking earlier. I took a couple of steps in that direction and called for her again. I was worried that she may have gotten her paws stuck between the rocks or gotten stuck in a snake hole. Suddenly, I felt something moving behind me. I looked around and looked down. It was Alfie. She had been staying close to me the whole time. I just hadn't seen her. So naturally, I was thinking, if Alfie is here, then what was in the woods? I took another step forward and the pit bulls began to growl. They were slowly advancing and were now on either side of me, looking right into the blackness of the woods. I quickly picked up Alfie and began to back up very slowly. I'm not sure what I thought was there, but there are a lot of animals in Maine, and I figured the dogs knew better than I did. Since I couldn't see anything, right as I turned around, I heard the most absolutely bone-chilling thing I've ever heard in my life. Coming from the direction of the woods, I heard someone or something call Alfie's name. It sounded almost as if it was trying to mimic me, but it was just all wrong. The voice sounded really distorted, and it almost seemed to wail. I freaked out and ran inside with the dogs. I have no idea what was out there in the woods. My camp is essentially a log cabin overlooking a lake, and our nearest neighbor, who's also family, lives at least a half a mile in the opposite direction of where that thing was. Creeps me out to this day.